All right, today is going to end our discussion on Sagittarius, the story of Joshua in the conquered land. And we've got just a few loose ends to tie up. And we're going to start with the story of Jericho before we do an overview of the book of Judges. Go to Joshua chapter 6. Joshua 6. Now, while you're turning there, we're going to start in verse 15, Joshua 6:15. In this particular part of the story, and these stories are familiar to all of us, so we're not going to read the entire story. We're just going to talk over you and then pick some things out. But in Joshua 2, Joshua sends two spies across the Jordan into Jericho to spy on the city to see what kind of military capacity it has. And this is before the Jordan parted. This is before they celebrated the first Passover inside the Promised Land. This is before God had Joshua circumcise all the males that had not been circumcised as they wandered in the wilderness. And it was also before Jesus showed up as the captain of the army of the Lord, right? So the sending of the spies really was the beginning of Joshua's part of the story. We didn't go into that later, but in all of chapters 2, as well as chapters 5, 6, and 7, the chapters that relate in any way to the story of Jericho, there's only two people other than Joshua who are named and that the story focuses on. Does anybody know who those two people are? One should be pretty obvious. Rahab, right? And there's one other. It's a guy. Nope. His name is Achan. Achan. We'll come back to his story. Now, Rahab, if you remember the story, she was a harlot. She was a prostitute. She was a pagan. But when the two spies went into the city and the king sent his soldiers to look for them, Rahab hid the two spies from the king's men. And in exchange, she and her family, whomever was within her home, within the walls of her house, when the walls of Jericho fell down, were basically passed over. And I use those words very specifically and intentionally because in Joshua 2:18, the spies told her that if she would hang a red scarf or a red rope outside of her window, they would know what apartment or what house she was in, and they would spare her life, those of her and her family. Of course, there's a big parallel here within the story of Passover in Egypt, where the blood of the lamb painted on the doorpost and the lintel was the sign that the angel of death would pass over the people that were in that house, and then he would move on to another one, right? And there's actually several parallels in the story of Jericho and things that happened in the past. One was this kind of link to the Passover, the original Passover. But there's also like a 6+1 pattern that we'll see here coming up in a second. And we see the 6+1 pattern in the creation week, right? 6 days of creation plus 1 day of Sabbath rest. We also see a 6+1 pattern in the agricultural cycle where the Jews were told to farm their land for 6 years and then let it rest for 1. Now, like I said, we're not going to read the whole story of Jericho. It's actually pretty simple to summarize. In chapter 6, God tells Joshua that for 6 days they were to march around the city one time with the ark. The soldiers were to remain completely silent, but there were 7 priests that had 7 trumpets, and as they marched around the city, they would blow these trumpets, and then they would stop. Like every day for 6 days, they would do it once. Now, and it just kind of came up to my mind. We just did our discussion on Revelation. We haven't talked about the trumpets, but it kind of seems like an interesting parallel, doesn't it? Right? 7 trumpets being blown. Right? We see that in the book of Revelation as well. But per God's instructions, on the 7th day, they were to march around the city in the same fashion, right? The Ark of the Covenant was there. The priests were there. The soldiers were there. The soldiers were to remain silent. The priests would continue to blow the horns, the trumpets, but this time they were to march around the city 7 times. And after the 7th circuit, when the last trumpet was sounded, well, let's read in verse 15. Joshua 6:15. But it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early about the dawning of the day and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. On that day only they marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened, when the priests blew the trumpets, that Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And you, by all means, abstain from the cursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpet. And, think again about what we see the picture of Christ returning, right? Christ descends with the shout of an archangel and with the trumpet blast, right? It's very, very stark imagery that we see played out here as well. And it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet and people shouted with a great shout that the wall fell down flat. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Now picture this in your mind. You've got a very large army, right? We've got 601, give or take a few hundred, 601,000 military people, and they have completely encircled the city. And if you were like me, up until I started rereading this and paying more attention to the details, I kind of had this thought that, almost like you see in like, I don't know, maybe a medieval movie, bless you, a medieval movie where the army that's approached like a castle and they're trying to take the castle and they're just kind of all sitting outside the front door. But in this circumstance, the army of Israel had completely encircled the city of Jericho. And as I'll show you in a second, Jericho was not all that large. And if Joshua deployed the entire army of Israel, which was 600,000 people strong, then the entire city would have been encircled, and it probably would have been hundreds, if not thousands, of people deep. I mean, imagine how terrified the people inside the city would have been to look out over the ramparts to see the army of Israel completely surrounded. If anyone have watched The Lord of the Rings, the first time you see the army of orcs and you see hundreds of thousands of these beasts, and you're like, this is terrifying. This is absolutely terrifying. I can imagine it was the same way for them. Verse 22, but Joshua had said to the two men who had spied out the country, go into the harlot's house, and from there bring out the woman and all that she has, as you swore to her. And the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had. So they brought out all of her relatives and left them outside the camp of Israel. But they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. So the walls fell first, and then the fire came afterwards. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Now, the story of Rahab is great, but it's there for a specific reason. Go to Matthew chapter 1. And I'm sure most of you guys know this part, but in the Gospels, there are two genealogies of Christ. One traces the genealogy of Christ through his adoptive father, Joseph, and the other traces the genealogy of Christ through Mary. Matthew 1:1 says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah got Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab, Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begat Salmon. Salmon begat Boaz by Rahab. So pause there for a second, and if this has not dawned on you before, if nobody has ever showed this to you, a pagan prostitute is in the lineage of Christ. That's an astounding thought, particularly when you look at how careful God has been over the generations that we've been studying to tell the people, listen, you don't intermarry with pagan nations, right? Now, what's the difference here? What's the difference? Did God go against his own rules? Now, we'll answer that coming up here in a second. So verse 5, Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab, Boaz begot Obed by Ruth, Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king. So obviously Rahab is not just an ancestor of Jesus the Christ, but she is also an ancestor of David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Skip down to verse 16. And Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who was called Christ. Right? So the story of Rahab is significant, not just because we get to see God and Joshua and the nation in action, not only because the battle at Jericho was the first battle, was the first step that the nation took to evict the inhabitants of the world of Canaan, but because of this link between Rahab and the process of election that ended up with us actually having Jesus, right? The son of Mary and the son of Joseph. So Rahab, a pagan prostitute, was the great grandmother of King David, and she was the great, and so on grandmother of Jesus the Christ, again, through his stepfather Joseph. Now, big question, what does the story of Rahab teach us? Because we don't know anything about her. We know a couple of details. She was a prostitute. Mm-hmm. She had a family. She lived in Jericho. She hid the spies. Mm-hmm. What else do we know? She married this guy named Salmon. She was the ancestor of David and Jesus. Go to Joshua 2:11. What's that? Yeah. So and we're going backwards, right? We're going back to the story where Joshua sent the spies in to look at the city. Joshua 2:11, this is Rahab speaking to the spies. She says, as soon as we heard these things, and what she's referring to is even the stories from 4 decades before when the Israelites came out of Egypt and the Red Sea parted, even that story had reached the people of Jericho, right? And so now we're looking at the hearts of the people of Jericho and their opinion of the Israelites and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's 4 decades old now. So she says, and as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. That's a pretty strong confession there, isn't it? Walter just said she would have had to become a proselyte in order to live in and among the Jewish nation. She would have had to have converted. And this is her confession right here, right? Your God, your Lord, is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. So apparently she changed her ways and she was accepted into the nation of Israel. Otherwise, Salmon would not have married her. Now, the Midrash, which is a rabbinical commentary on the Old Testament, teaches that Rahab married Joshua. But Matthew clearly states that Rahab married this man named Salmon. And there are some other traditions that teach that Salmon was one of the 2 spies that Joshua had sent into the city. I don't think we can prove that one way or another, but that thought is out there. Kind of makes sense to me, right? I mean, I can see how that would fit into the story, but it doesn't mean that actually was the way it is. Now, either way, her conversion is a huge lesson for Christians and non-Christians alike, who have the false notion that God waits for perfection and perfect obedience before he lets you into his family. Because she certainly wasn't perfect at that point, was she? Had done one good deed, and that was to protect the spies. But it was her confession of the sovereignty of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that allowed her to become a proselyte and to begin to learn what it means to be a Jew at that particular time. Like she was a convert to Judaism. Do you have any comments on that? You're kind of like nodding. Like I think there's some wisdom behind that nod there.
I'm just thinking the thief on the cross. He certainly had shown no perfection.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah.
But he acknowledged that Jesus Christ was the Lord.
Yeah.
King of Kings.
And Christ gave him his fate right there. You know, today I say to you, you will be with me. Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. So we look at the story of Rahab and we can pull out some of these things. We're only given a handful of details, but the major thing that we see is her willingness to protect the two Jewish spies, but her recognition of the sovereignty of God, and that allowed her to become part of the nation, and even more so, it allowed her to become part of the lineage of Christ, which is an amazing thing. But what about the bigger picture? What's the lesson of the story of Jericho?
That God moves in strange ways.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. Now, why do you say it that way?
Because they thought they'd have to take it by force.
Yeah, this was not a traditional military victory, was it?
No.
Not at all. I mean, these people were stricken by fear before they even had to confront anybody. And the only thing that happened what happened that allowed them to take the city, probably with very little, if no casualties on their side, was an act of God. You know, the trumpet blast, the shout of the soldiers. Another lesson in the story is that God spared some non-Israelites who were willing to confess his sovereignty, willing to bow down to him. Now, here's some archaeology. You can't talk about Jericho without maybe looking at some archaeological things. And I apologize, I don't think the contrast is all that great up there. But on the top picture there, that's a modern day picture of Jericho. That mound is called a tell, and I'm sure you've heard that term before. But a tell basically is just a dirt mound. That little tiny figure right up in the middle there, that little vertical spike, that's a person. That's a man standing up on the top of the tell. And on the bottom left is an artist's depiction or rendition of what the outer perimeter of the defenses of Jericho would look like. That green arrow points to the retaining wall that kept all the dirt of the mound in place and kept it from spilling out over the edges. And that mound that is kept by the retaining wall has on top of it what's called the lower wall. It was a mud and brick wall that was built as part of its outer defenses, right? And if you, again, have seen pictures of castles and know some of the terminology, this might be called a parapet. You know, if you see a castle with a big stone wall and soldiers walking across the top, this is what it was, and it encircled the entire city. In fact, there were two walls. There was the lower wall. Actually, there were three. There was the retaining wall itself, which is what the arrow is pointing to. Then there is the mud and brick wall, the lower wall that encircled the perimeter, and then up higher there was the upper wall. And the upper wall actually, according to the archaeological digs that are there, and there's been many over the last close to 100 years or so, separated Jericho into two different parts, like the good side of the street and the bad side of the street, right? The poor people tended to live down around the outer wall, where the more affluent people, their homes were within the perimeter of the upper wall. Because if you could look straight down on the city of Jericho, you would see two walls that each form a circle, right? The upper wall encircled the city proper. The lower wall encircled a larger portion. That's where the poor people lived, and that was part of the outer defenses. But you can see, just to give you some scale, down just below that green arrow, there's a figure of an average man. The retaining wall that keeps all the dirt in, that forms the base for the lower wall, part of the outer defense, was in places 18 to 20 feet high. And so Jericho was pretty much impregnable. You know, it's almost like it doesn't matter how many people you have, how are you going to get in? And in fact, what we know about the time of the year, if you guys remember, this was around the spring harvest, right? The Jews had just celebrated, or were about to celebrate, Pentecost. I'm sorry, not Pentecost, Passover. So it was the barley harvest. And what we know about this time of the year is that a city like Jericho would have had a lot of food inside it. And in fact, as part of archaeological excavations, when they dig down and down and down and down, they find these clay pots that are full of grain. And part of this, you start looking at elements like this in archaeology, it implies that the destruction of the city came very quickly. because these are completely preserved, right? It's almost a fully intact pot full of grain. Had the destruction of the city happened over a long period of time, all of this stuff would have, Chase, would you go check that? This stuff still wouldn't be here as intact as we see it. The other thing that made Jericho fairly impenetrable was not only did they have all the grain that they had harvested from the barley harvest, they had their own source of water inside the city walls. And that prevents an enemy from being able to come in and poison your water or shut it off to the point where a week later you're ready to give up because you're dying. Or you can only last a few days without water before you become weak and lethargic. Here in the bottom right corner is another picture of some of the excavations. You can see a man down here standing outside the retaining wall. Remember, this is the base of the lower wall, which is part of that perimeter. And you can see here in the excavation, there's clear evidence of houses that were built up against the lower wall. And again, this is where the poorer people would have lived. The archaeological reports suggest that in some cases, these houses, the walls were just like a single brick thick. Whereas if you were more affluent, you would build thicker walls and have more stable foundations. Here's an aerial view. So up on the left there, you can see kind of like a Google map picture. And it's hard to see what the scale is, but it takes about 30 minutes to walk around the entire city. So it's probably not as big as you thought it was. And even though it was relatively small, and the population was probably relatively small as well, because of where it was situated, because they had their own water supply, because they had food within the city walls, and the city and its fortifications were built the way it was, it would have been hard to defeat the people in the city of Jericho. The squares and the rectangles that you see in that left aerial view, a lot of those are actually sites of excavations. And again, there have been many different teams of excavators going back at least to the 1930s, where they have found evidence of the ancient Jericho civilization, not civilization, but the people. Now, on the southeast bottom part of the picture, so down the left-hand picture, down on the bottom right-hand side, so that's oriented north is up, south is down. So on that bottom right-hand corner of that mound, the excavators, one in particular named Kathleen Kenyon, found a burn layer that was 3 feet thick. But you had to dig down to find it. And here's a quotation from one of her papers. "The destruction was complete. Walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks, timbers, and household utensils. In most rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burned, but the collapse of the walls of the eastern rooms seems to have taken place before they were affected by fire." Now, what's interesting about that is it matches the biblical account, right? The walls fell with a shout, they went into the city, they killed everyone, and they burnt it. Interesting thing is, Kathleen Kenyon is not a Christian. She's a secularist. I believe she's an atheist, or I don't think she's still alive. But it's not like she was trying to validate the biblical account. Now, on the right-hand side, you see just a drawing of the same shape of the boundaries of Jericho. And the green circle that I have there is the northern wall, and this wall is still intact. If you were to go take a tour of Jericho, you would see that the wall around 98% of the city fallen down, just like we see in the biblical account. But in this one particular place, right on the northeastern edge, the city is completely intact. And what happened, what the excavators and the archaeological report say, and there have been biblical archaeologists as well as secular that kind of look and say the same thing, is that when the walls fell down, they filled in all the spaces that were the natural spaces and obstacles to getting up into the city. They filled in those spaces, so the Israelite armies basically had a nice walkway to get into the city to go take over everything, right? And remember, they surrounded the entire city, and if that city is only maybe, I don't know, 1.5 miles in perimeter, and you've got 600,000 soldiers arrayed around the city, again, many soldiers deep, it wouldn't have taken long for the entire city to be completely overrun with the Israelites as soon as those walls fell. That's probably where Rahab lived, right up there. That's where she would have put the red scarf or the red rope outside to signal to the two spies, this is where we are, this is where we live. And Joshua said, go get them. Let's spare those people. Comments or questions on this? Anybody seen this before, some of these things? Every time I look into some of the archaeology, and I am no expert, but some of the stuff is fairly easy to find. It just, I don't know, it just strengthens my faith, right? To see all these different biblical stories played out in the archaeological record. So that's the first of the two people mentioned in the stories in chapters 2 and then 5, 6, and 7. The other one is a man named Achan. You remember when Joshua was giving instructions? You know, hey, when you hear the shout, here's what you do. But listen, take all the gold and the silver and the bronze and stick it in the treasury, but do not take any of the accursed things, lest you bring it into the camp, and the camp is accursed. Well, Achan didn't listen. Go to Joshua 7:10. The story of Achan links the stories of Jericho and the next city that they went against called Ai, and I think completes the main takeaway message from all of these chapters, right? Whereas Rahab was a positive example, Achan is an example of what not to do, right? Rahab showed us that someone who was not part of God's family can choose the right thing and honor God and become part of God's family, whereas Achan's is the exact opposite, where someone who is part of God's family can choose to do wrong and then suffer dire consequences. The story of Achan is pretty simple, right? God tells Joshua again not to tell the people, don't take any of the cursed things. Achan ended up taking silver and gold and a Babylonian garment, and he stuck them in his tent. So when Israel went to fight against the next city, and Ai was smaller and less well fortified. So in man's natural reason, it should have been easier for them to defeat Ai than the battle that they had with Jericho. Granted, God gave them the victory, right? But what ended up happening? Joshua went up with a few thousand men, and they got spanked. They lost like 35, 36 men. So Joshua goes to God, and he whines just like all the people in the wilderness did. Like, oh, why did you bring us out here to die? We should have stayed on the other side of the Jordan. So Joshua 7:10, God had enough. He's like, so the Lord said to Joshua, get up. Why are you lying on your face like this? Israel has sinned. And they have also transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them, for they've even taken some of the accursed things and have both stolen and deceived, and they have also put it among their own stuff. Now, how many people went against God's law? One person. Yet he keeps saying they, Israel, the whole nation. Right? God was still in the training phase. God was still dealing with the nation as a whole and teaching individuals that they were part of a collective and how the actions of one person can affect the whole. You guys with me on that? Right? So verse 12, therefore the children of Israel could not stand before their enemies, but turned their backs before their enemies because they had become doomed to destruction. Neither will I be with you any more unless you destroy the accursed from among you. Get up, sanctify the people, and say, sanctify yourselves for tomorrow, because thus says the Lord God of Israel, there's an accursed thing in your midst, O Israel. You cannot stand before your enemies until you take away the accursed thing from among you. Now, the outcome of Achan's treachery, he was discovered, and he and his entire family and all of their animals were stoned to death, and then they were all burned. And then Joshua led them to victory over the same people that had just handed them defeat very easily by the account. So my question is, why was God so strict here? It was just one guy, it was just some silver, and it was only one shirt. Why was God being so strict?
I gave you a glass of water and put one drop of cyanide in it when you drink it. Poison. It take one person to create sin in a nation, but it can spread. Well, he did it, and I did it.
You kind of look at the symbolism of leaven and unleavened bread with Passover, right? A little leaven leavens the whole lump. You know, when the congregation allows someone in their midst to so clearly go against a direct order from God, and that's tolerated, what's next? Yeah.
I was just thinking too, going back to our discussion before of how God is just black and white in the Old Testament. You do wrong, that's it.
Yep. Right, and so this new nation is still learning obedience, right? They're still learning obedience, and this is a generation that had the stories, but not the personal experience of the time coming out of Egypt and wandering in the wilderness. Most of these people were born, sometime after that, right? Different generation. Again, teaching that the actions of one person can affect the whole, but also there's this underlying principle that God's way is the only way to victory and success. It's the only way. Now, there are a couple of final stories in the book of Joshua, and I'm just going to touch on these because I want to get to a summary of the book of Judges before we end. But in Joshua 9, there's a story of what's called the Gibeonite deception. What ends up happening is because it's like news travels fast in this time period, and everyone had heard about the fame of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob coming from Egypt and parting the Red Sea and defeating all the people that came against them while they were in the wilderness. And then all of a sudden they're on our side of the water and are like, uh-oh, what's going on? So these Gibeonites, and if you go back through some, like not just biblical records, but look at old maps and look at scholarly commentary, the city of Gibeon, or the region of Gibeon, was quite a bit larger than Jericho. They had more soldiers, they had a bigger city, they had more resources. But here's what the Gibeonites did. Joshua 9:1. And it came to pass when all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan, in the hills and in the lowland, and in all the coasts of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, the Ites, they heard about it, that they gathered together to fight with Joshua and Israel with one accord. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors. And they took old sacks on their donkeys, old wineskins torn and mended, old and patched sandals on their feet, and old garments on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. Now here's the interesting thing. Gibeon was not far from Jericho and Ai. So when it says that they worked craftily and they dressed in old ratty clothes and took moldy bread and went to talk to the Jews, what do you think they were doing? Well, if you read the stories, the first thing come out of their mouths was like, oh, we've come from such a long way. We've been traveling forever. Please don't hurt us. They basically pretended to be ambassadors from people afar off, and they wanted to make a truce with Israel. They deceived them, and Joshua was deceived. What ended up happening was that Joshua basically the Gibeonites extracted a covenant with Joshua for protection and for peace. And when the Jews found out that the Gibeonites lived like just around the corner, they were angry and they demanded that Joshua destroy them. But he refused because he had sworn loyalty to them and made an oath to God. He said, no, we can't. Doesn't matter if they deceived us. I swore an oath to God that we would be at peace with them, so we're going to be at peace with them. I don't know how long it took for the Jews to calm down after that, but what's the lesson there for you and I? How many times do we get into a circumstance in life where someone does something wrong, and we might be righteously angry and indignant? I think we have to choose our response to that very, very carefully. Why?
Because we don't know God's plan.
Because we may not have all the facts yet.
right? Agree?
Reflects on God.
Reflects on God, right? Our actions reflects on God. And forgive me, I can't pull the verse, but it talks about how we walk among unbelievers and walking among them in such a way that we uphold the character and the legacy of God rather than doing anything that our actions impugn his character. Does that make sense? Right? Now, in Joshua 10, there's a coalition of southern kings that gather to fight against the Gibeonites because they align themselves with the Jews. So the Gibeonites send to Joshua and say, hey, these people are coming against us because we're aligned with you. Come help us. And so Israel goes to war, defends Gibeon, destroys all these southern kings. And then not long after that, there's a coalition of the kings of the north. And the Bible says that they numbered as the sand of the sea, and they had horses and chariots. Remember, at this point, the Jews weren't using horses and chariots in war. But God gave them the victory there as well. And obviously the people had learned, at least for now, had learned their lesson. Obedience to God. You follow his rules. If you do, he'll give you the victory. If not, you might be in a circumstance that looks like the odds are in your favor, but it's not going to work out too well for you. Joshua 13 to 22 is all about land surveys and dividing the land among the tribes, but also among the families within the tribes. And in somewhere in those chapters, God lists all the nations that the Jews had not yet driven out. But, regardless of the fact that they hadn't driven out all these people, God still tells them to go ahead and divide up the land among the 9.5 tribes that were going to stay on the proper side of the Jordan. Joshua 23 to 24 is like a mini Deuteronomy. Joshua recounts the blessings of obedience. He recounts the curse of disobedience. And he gives a prophecy that he fully expects that at some point the people of Israel are going to turn from God once he's dead. And he's actually at the end of Joshua, he's at the end of his life. He dies at 110 years old. Go to Judges chapter 2 now. Let's transition into this particular book. I may have to go a little bit long just to finish this off because I don't want to go into the story of David yet. Or I don't want to steal from the story of David. But I don't remember, I don't know if you remember, but a few lessons ago I had pointed out that the book of Joshua was a book of victory and success. Right? Yeah, they had a couple of lessons to learn, but once they got it, they got it. And it was victory after victory after victory after victory after victory. The book of Judges stands in stark contrast to that because it's really a record of Israel's failures. The first 1.5 chapters, the book of Judges recounts the story of Joshua in very big picture, and it talks about how Israel fails to drive the Canaanites out of the land. Let's pick it up in Judges 2, verse 6. This is after the land had been allotted. And when Joshua had dismissed the people, the children of Israel went each to his own inheritance to possess the land. So the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Now Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died when he was 110 years old, and they buried him within the border of his inheritance at Timnah-Heres, in the mountains of Ephraim, on the north side of Mount Gaash. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. Sorry, someone's knocking on my back door. Come on. Come on inside. Verse 11. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Now, who are the Baals?
Pagan gods.
Pagan gods, specifically Canaanites, right? And sometimes Baals is just a generic term for gods, plural. Baal was a deity, as was Ashtoreth, for example. They're noted in verse 13. But when it's in the plural there, it just refers to the pagan gods of the people of the land of Canaan. And they forsook the Lord of their fathers who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtoreth. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, so he delivered them into the hands of plunderers who despoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand against their enemies. Wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. But notice this word, nevertheless. The Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked. In obeying the commandments of the Lord, they did not do so. And when the Lord had raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge, for the Lord was moved with pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead, that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers. By following other gods to serve them and bow down to them, they did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn ways. Man, that sounds like the warnings in Revelation, doesn't it? It sounds like the description of the bowls of wrath. Nevertheless, they did not repent of their sorceries and their idolatry. Then the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord, to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not. Therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hands of Joshua. So we see this downward spiral, right? Each generation seems to get worse than the last. When it says in verse 19, when the judge was dead, they behaved more corruptly than their fathers. Now, question, did God go back on his word? Because previously, even back as far as Moses, he promised to go personally before Israel and to drive out the nations that inhabited the promised land. So God now was going like, no, I'm not going to be with you. I'm not going to drive these people out. Is he going back on his word? Why not?
Because it was conditional from the get-go.
Conditional on what?
Their obedience.
Obedience, spiritual fidelity, forsaking the ways of the pagan nations. Do not do these things. You will not take the ways of the Canaanites and the Amorites, etc. Right? And again, once again, we see God following through on the conditions and the rules that he had previously communicated very, very clearly and on multiple occasions to each and every single generation. Now, what happened was that periodically Israel would be conquered and they would serve other nations, and then a judge would rise up and he would free them for that. So, for example, I'm just going to give you a couple examples here. Judges 3:8 says that they served the king of Mesopotamia for 8 years. Judges 3:14 says they served Moab for 18 years, but then they had like 80 years of rest after that. Judges 4:30, they served Canaan for another 20 years. And it's so in this pattern just keeps repeating that they would be under the control of pagan nations, and then God would raise up a judge, and they would fight, and they would get victory, and they would turn back to God for a time, and they would have a period of rest, and then it would just start all over again. Same song, different station, right? So here's the question. Who are the judges? Not asking for names, but in the big scheme of things, like up until now, the nation had been governed, if you will, by, prophets like Moses and, Aaron the high priest. And they continued to have high priests. And then, Joshua was more a man of war, but he certainly prophesied that Israel would turn from God after he died. So who were the judges? And what time frame are we looking at? Like, where are we in God's 6,000-year story? Where is the story of the judges? Give me some context and time frame. What year was Abraham born from creation? Let's start over here. Creation is year 1. Abraham was born 2000. Christ was born when? 4000, right? King David was when? About the year 3000. So from Abraham to King David is about 1,000 years, right? The Exodus happened in the year 2500. They spent 41 years before they went into the promised land. Joshua lived for another couple of decades. So let's say that by the time we're into the story of Judges and Joshua's died, and I could go back to Tim's Time of the End book and give you a specific date, but we're probably maybe about 400 years before the time of David. Somewhere around there, probably about 400 years. So the period of the Judges spans about 4 centuries. But what's the difference between the way the nation was governed prior to Judges and during the period of Judges? Like, were the judges like kings? Were they prophets? Were they all prophets? Well, there's only one that I can see that was actually named as a prophet. That was Deborah. So here's a couple of things to think about. The very first judge was Caleb's younger brother, Othniel. He's the one that threw off the yoke of the Mesopotamian king, Othniel. So I should have named you guys Othniel. Chase Othniel Noseworthy. He was from the tribe of Judah, right? So first of all, the judges were not rulers in the sense of all of them were prophets. They weren't all priests. Actually, I don't know if any of them came from the tribe of Levi. They didn't function as kings, but it does say that they judged Israel. They came from different tribes. So Othniel was from Judah. The next one, Ehud, was from Benjamin. Then Deborah, I couldn't find a reference as to which tribe she was on, but obviously a woman, right? So a woman could be a judge, and it was also noted in her story that she was a prophetess. But despite being from different tribes and not holding these, positions or offices, if you will, like we might say of someone like Moses or Joshua, the Bible does say that they judged the nation of Israel, which implies that they would have been the person to go to if there was some kind of a major dispute. Now, remember at this point, the nation had all dispersed to their respective lands. So there would have been local tribal leaders and tribal structure that if you could settle your issues within your own family, within your own tribe, great. But if something exceeded or superseded that, probably went to the judge. There are 4 judges that the Bible says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon them. Only 4. That was Othniel, the first one, Gideon, Jephthah, and then Samson. So they were specifically noted as being empowered by the holy breath of God for whatever that actually tells us. Now, all I can do right now is just kind of give you an overview, because if you read through the book of Judges, there's all these different stories. There's a bunch of them, but none of them, well, a couple. The story of Jephthah, the story of Gideon, the story of Samson goes into a lot more detail, but the story of Othniel is very short. The story of Deborah and Barak, fairly short. But I want to give you the big picture. In chapters 6 through 9, we have the story of Gideon and the story of his son Abimelech. Gideon was, in his words, I am the least of the smallest tribe of Israel. Yet God chose him to judge the nation and to lead them in war against the Midianites. The problem was he overcame his lack of faith, and he did so in some spectacular ways, right? This is the story of the fleece. Gideon challenged God on 2 different occasions just to make sure that what he was hearing from God was what he was hearing from God. He said, okay, Lord, if this is true, I'm going to throw this fleece down, and in the morning it's going to be wet on the fleece, but the ground around it will be dry. And that's exactly what happened. And he said, okay, that was great. That was great. Still not convinced. It was more of a lack of confidence in himself than it was a confidence in God. But he said, okay, let's do this again. But this time, the ground will be wet, but the fleece will be dry. And that's exactly what happened. And so Gideon said, okay, I guess I am your guy. And then ultimately he goes through this selection process, and he goes against the entire Midianite nation with 300 men. And God gives him the victory. Right? And again, he's one of the 4 judges that was empowered, if you will, by the holy breath of God. After their victory, go to Judges chapter 8:22. After the victory against the Midianites, the men of Israel ask him to be their ruler. This is like the first sign that the nation is now starting to think, like, we need to have like one person to go to, because having a whole bunch of tribal territorialism isn't working out. We're not really a united nation anymore, and we're getting conquered left and right. It's great that these judges keep coming up, but man, things would probably be different if we had one king. So they ask him to be their ruler, and he says no. So in Judges 8:22, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, this is after they conquered the Midianites, rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hands of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Smart man, right? Then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you, that each of you would give me the earrings from his plunder, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. So they answered, we will gladly give them. And they spread out a garment, and each man threw it into the earrings from his plunder. Now the weight of gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around their camels' necks. Now look at this. Then Gideon made it into an ephod and set it up in his city Ophrah. And all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. So the man who was smart enough to go, I don't need to be your king because God's your king, created this golden ephod, which was a priestly garment, and it became a pagan idol. And it said it was a snare to Gideon and to his entire household. Now his story gets a little bit worse. Gideon apparently was a very fertile man. He had 70 sons from his official wife, but he also had concubines. There was one son named Abimelech, who was the son of a concubine who was from the area of Shechem. You guys remember Shechem? Remember the story of Dinah and the prince of Shechem who fell in love with her, and he violated her in the sense that they had sex before and I believe consensual, before they got married, and then Simeon and Levi tricked them and killed all these guys. Remember that story? This is the same place, Shechem. So Abimelech was the son of Gideon through a Shechemite concubine. He plotted with his brothers on the mother's side to kill all but one of 70 of Gideon's sons on Gideon's wife's side, on his father's side. And once he did that, he was proclaimed king of Shechem. But the one son of Gideon that was left alive, named Jotham, prophesied against him. And 3 years later, Abimelech destroyed Shechem. And then not long after that, Abimelech died when a lady who was high up in a tower that Abimelech was trying to conquer dropped a big stone right on his head. So the prophecy of Jotham came true, because he said there was going to be fire between he and Shechem. Now, after Abimelech was dead, the Philistines and the Amorites oppressed the Israelites for another 18 years. And now God calls on a bandit named Jephthah in Judges chapter 11. Go to Judges 11:29. Now, there's kind of a little bit of a pre-story, but if you read the pre-story, you'll realize that Jephthah has a band of marauders. Like, it's not like he's this pristine figure. He's like hanging out in the mountains with his boys, setting upon people, taking their stuff. But this is the man that God calls to judge Israel. He's one of the men that says the Spirit of God came upon him. So it's not like he just accidentally tripped and fell into the role of judge. God chose him and God empowered him. So Judges 11:29, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh and passed through Mizpah of Gilead. From Mizpah of Gilead he advanced toward the people of Ammon. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will indeed deliver the people of Ammon into my hands, then it will be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the people of Ammon shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. Now, picture this. It's been 18 years of oppression. Jephthah has been hanging out in the mountains, working like a bandit, and all of a sudden he finds himself in the position of being the judge of Israel, and it's his job to lead Israel against the nation who's been oppressing them for 18 years, the Ammonites. And as he's getting ready to go to war, he says, Lord, if you help me out here, whatever greets me when I came home, it's yours. He was probably expecting like a chicken or a sheep or something to come out, right? Maybe it was, a favorite dog or something. I don't know. Now, this story can be quite troubling because as you read it, God gives Jephthah the victory. And as he's coming home, the first thing that comes greet him is his daughter, his only child. He doesn't have any other kids. His daughter comes out. Now, almost every pastor that I've heard speak on this, and most commentaries that I've read, say that he burned her as a human sacrifice to God. And they point to the failings of Jephthah. Like he didn't understand how God worked, and so he sacrificed his daughter. He burned her on an altar. I don't think that's what happened at all. I think he knew exactly how God worked. Otherwise, why would he have made the vow? He knew the history of Israel, right? Align yourself with God, be obedient. And we also see when his daughter comes out, and we'll read it here in a second, that he's like, oh, you're killing me. I made this vow to God, and I can't not follow through. That's not the sign of somebody who doesn't understand how God works. He knew exactly what it meant. So, verse 34. When Jephthah came to his house at Mizpah, there was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrels and dancing. She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. And it came to pass, when he saw her, that he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You are among those who trouble me, for I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot go back on it. So she said to him, My father, if you have given your word to the Lord, do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, because the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the people of Ammon. Then she said to her father, Let this thing be done for me. Let me alone for 2 months, that I may go and wander on the mountains and bewail my virginity, my friends and I. So he said, Go, and he sent her away for 2 months, and she went with her friends and bewailed her virginity on the mountains. And it was so at the end of 2 months that she returned to her father, and he carried out his vow with her which he had vowed. She knew no man. Now, what's more likely? That after 2 months that she came down and he laid her down on a stone table and plunged a knife into her heart and burned her alive or while she was dying? Or that maybe the translation and the language is a little bit off, and because of the focus on bewailing her virginity and the statement that she knew no man, maybe the vow was, whatever comes out to meet me, I will dedicate to the Lord. And if it's an animal, yeah, we're going to sacrifice it. But guess what? It was your daughter. So instead of killing your daughter like you would do to an animal, by the way, does God love human sacrifice? No, he detests it. The historical record is very clear. So what did he do? What was his vow? How was it accomplished? How did he keep his word? Yeah, that's right. The first Hebrew convent.
Yeah.
Right, she had to dedicate her life. She couldn't get married. She had to serve the Lord. That's why it talks about bewailing her virginity and how she knew no man. It would be completely incompatible with the character of God for this man, in completing his vow, it wouldn't have been acceptable for him to burn her as a human sacrifice. Completely incompatible. Now, we have a couple of other stories just based on time here. We have the story of Samson in chapters 13 to 16. We all know how that ends, right? He ends up basically a pawn of his enemies, and he's chained between these two pillars, and there were a couple of thousand nobles and pagans hanging around, and they're having him perform for him, and he prays to God to get his strength back, and he pulls the temple down on top of them and kills all of his enemies. And there are actually other stories that continue on, but let's just leave with this. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The statement is made 4 times in the book of Judges. Judges 17:6. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 18:1. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in, for until that day, their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. What ended up happening in Judges 18 with these Danites is that they came across a young Levite priest, and they convinced him to become their high priest, and they built a pagan temple. And the tribe of Dan fell into paganism. Judges 19. And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite staying in a remote mountain of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him, and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for 4 whole months. So the story goes on about how the Levite went to her father's house and got her, and they started to travel, and they went to a city, and they waited around for someone to invite them to stay at their home, because that's what the culture was, right? If you were traveling, you went to the city, like the courtyard, and somebody would come along and say, hey, dude, you're like traveling, come on, stay with me for the night. So they go to this person's house, and it was a Benjamite city. And so the men of the city came to the house, and this sounds an awful lot like Sodom and Gomorrah. They came, they started banging on the doors, hey, let's have these women that we may know them. So what does the Levite do? He's terrified. He takes the concubine and throws her out to them. They rape her all night long, and they beat her to death. The next morning he gets up, and he's all like affronted. So he cuts her up in pieces and sends her body parts out through the lands of Israel to incite the entire nation to go to war against Benjamin. And that's exactly what happens. But you know what's interesting? It says that God gave the Israelites the victory against Benjamin. So now not only are we seeing this descending cycle of each generation getting worse than the one before, and this very well-established pattern of having a righteous leader and the nation turns back to God, but when they're dead, they go back to their old ways, they keep following pagans. But now we have Levites defecting and becoming high priests of pagan religions and cutting up their concubines and inciting civil war. And yes, God had a hand in that, because what the inhabitants of the city of Benjamin did was unforgivable. They had to be punished. But now we see civil war. The book of Joshua ends with this statement, or Judges, sorry. Judges 21:24 says, since the children of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What was the point of the 400 years when Israel was governed as a whole bunch of different tribes with periodic judges to guide them and lead them? We've talked before about the point of the times of oppression, their time in Egypt, right? The time in Egypt was to get them to cry out for justice, to give them the law that they couldn't keep, to point them to their Savior. What was the point of the book of Judges? Was it just like, okay, here's the record of a bunch of bad mistakes? Is that it? Is that the lesson? Or is the lesson, in those days there was no king in Israel? That once the tribes dispersed and the tribes were responsible for governing themselves in a land that they failed to fully evict the pagans that would infect their culture, their thinking, their religion, does it make sense that they needed one person to unite them all, to get them back to following the law of God? That's really the point of that time of the Judges. It's another step along the way. It's another training point, is what it was. And it was all to prepare them for the monarchy, which began, of course, with Saul, and then the next Mazarah sign that we're going to talk about is Capricorn, which is the story of David. But it's not just the story of David, it's the story of the time of the kings, when Israel was governed through a monarchy. Any questions or comments about either Judges or Joshua? Yeah.
I was just thinking that, so I mean, obviously we understand now why there was no king or anything in that particular time frame, but just reading that scripture, I feel like it applies to us in this day where we don't necessarily have a king. We have to do what's right according to our own eyes, so to speak, but it's really God's word that we have to do right by.
Yeah, and it's a circumstance that's really no different than the people, right? One of the things that Tim has helped me understand, and he's taught this in the bring-ins over the last couple of years, is that God does deal with us as a unit, right? The fellowship, the body of Christ. Now, we are individuals within that. We have rules that govern how the body is to behave, and it's up to us as individuals to follow those rules or not. But as a body, if we, just like the story of Achan, if we allow the accursed things to be within the congregation, it's not going to go well for the whole congregation. And I'm not saying that we get in each other's business and start, ferreting out where each one of us is failing, because we all are. But it's making sure that we don't make these really big mistakes, right? Just the really glaring errors, like, hey, if I tell you to kick everyone out, kick everyone out. If I tell you to destroy the nation, destroy the nation. And we see that very, very specifically with a story later coming up in this next era or next age, if you will. When God says spare, you spare. When God says kill, you kill. So just like the Israelites, we have very clear communication. We know the consequences of obedience and disobedience, and it's up to us as individuals how we contribute to the integrity of the whole, and whether or not we as individuals receive the blessing or receive the curse. Anything else?
The sad thing to me is back when you read the scriptures where Joshua died and all the elders of that generation died, and so the next generation did not know the Lord. That's so sad.
Whose failure is that?
The parents' failure. Yeah. They didn't teach their children. I was thinking of you and you and Kathy and the boys, in that those people didn't spend any time teaching their children about God, like Moses had told them that generation to do. That's sad.
So it's like a solemn responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think that's why you see verses like, when you rise up and when you lay down, when you're walking along the path, keep the word of the Lord before your eyes.
I mean, it was just glaring.
We forget easily, both individually or as individuals and as a collective. The modern church has forgotten an awful lot about its own history. An awful lot, right? And if you were to just randomly ask a modern day Christian to roughly map out the history of the church from the first century to where we are right now, they wouldn't be able to do it. And I couldn't have done it a few years ago until I said, I need to know this stuff. This is my responsibility. I need to know her history because I don't want to make the same mistakes, even though I do. I don't want to, right? Any final words, comments? No? Joe, you want to pray?